The stagecoach lurched to a stop, sending up a cloud of dust that seemed to hang in the afternoon air like a curtain between worlds. Rebecca Collins gathered her worn traveling dress and stepped down onto the hard-packed dirt of Main Street, her boots making a soft thud that was immediately swallowed by the vast emptiness of the frontier town. She stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the harsh sunlight that bleached everything to shades of brown and gray. The town of Coyote Ridge sprawled before her like a collection of weathered bones, wooden buildings leaning against each other for support, their paint peeling like old skin. A few horses stood tied to hitching posts, their tails swishing lazily at flies. Somewhere, a dog barked, then fell silent. Rebecca's hand unconsciously moved to the small leather pouch hanging from her neck, hidden beneath the high collar of her dress. Inside was all that remained of her former life. A wedding ring, now sold for coach fare, had left only its memory and the thin gold chain that once held it. Thomas had been dead for 3 months now, crushed beneath tons of rock when the Copper Queen mine collapsed. The official report blamed faulty timber supports, but Rebecca knew better. Thomas had written her about the mine owner's cost-cutting measures, about the groaning wood that should have been replaced months ago. The coach driver threw down her single carpet bag with little ceremony. "End of the line, ma'am," he said, already turning to tend to his horses. The other passengers, a traveling salesman and an elderly couple, had disembarked at the previous stop, leaving Rebecca to face Coyote Ridge alone. She picked up her bag, feeling the weight of everything she owned in the world, and began walking toward the nearest establishment that looked like it might offer lodging. The Grand Hotel, despite its name, was a 2-story affair with a sagging porch and windows clouded with dust. As she climbed the steps, she noticed the curtains twitch in several windows along the street. Already she was being watched, measured, judged. The hotel clerk, a thin man with pomaded hair and suspicious eyes, looked up from his ledger as she entered. The lobby smelled of old tobacco and lye soap, with undertones of something else, desperation perhaps, or dreams gone stale. "Good afternoon," Rebecca said, setting down her bag. "I'd like a room, please." The clerk's eyes traveled from her dusty boots to her unadorned black dress, pausing at her ungloved hands. A widow, traveling alone. His mouth pursed as if he'd tasted something sour. "We're full up," he said, not bothering to check his register. Rebecca had expected this. In the weeks since Thomas's death, she'd encountered the same cold reception in a dozen towns. A young widow without family, without connections, without a man's protection. She was trouble waiting to happen, or so they believed. "I can pay," she said quietly, reaching for her purse. "I said we're full." The clerk's tone brooked no argument. Behind her, the door opened, and she heard boots on the wooden floor, but she kept her eyes on the clerk. "Perhaps you could recommend another establishment?" she asked, maintaining her dignity even as her heart sank. "You might try the Sunset Lodge, 2 blocks down, though I doubt Mrs. Henley will have space either." The dismissal in his voice was clear. Rebecca picked up her bag and turned to leave, nearly colliding with a woman in a garish purple dress who'd entered behind her. The woman, clearly one of the soiled doves who worked the saloons, gave Rebecca a look of sympathy mixed with warning before sashaying up to the desk. "Room 12, sugar?" the woman asked the clerk, who handed over a key with a practiced smile, apparently having plenty of rooms for the right sort of customer. Back on the street, Rebecca straightened her shoulders and began walking. The Sunset Lodge was indeed 2 blocks down, a smaller establishment that looked even less promising than the Grand Hotel. Mrs. Henley, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, gave the same verdict. No rooms available. By the time Rebecca had tried 4 more places, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Her feet ached, and dust had worked its way into every fold of her dress. At the Territorial Inn, she didn't even make it past the threshold before being turned away. At Ma Fletcher's rooms, the proprietress claimed all her beds were taken by permanent boarders. The last establishment on Main Street was barely worthy of the name. The Dusty Spur sat at the far end of town, where the respectable businesses gave way to saloons and other establishments of questionable reputation. It was more tavern than hotel, with the rooms above that were usually rented by the hour rather than the night. Rebecca hesitated outside, watching the shadows lengthen across the street. She had little choice now. Darkness would soon fall, and she couldn't spend the night on the street. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the swinging doors. The interior was thick with smoke and the smell of whiskey. Men sat hunched over cards at scarred wooden tables, while painted women circulated with bottles and fixed smiles. Conversations died as Rebecca entered, all eyes turning to assess this unexpected visitor. The bartender, a massive man with arms like ham hocks, paused in wiping down the bar. "You lost, ma'am." "I need a room for the night," Rebecca said, aware of how her cultured voice stood out in this rough place. Someone snickered. Another man muttered something that made his companions laugh. Rebecca kept her gaze steady on the bartender. "This ain't really the place for a lady," he said, not unkindly. "I've tried every other establishment in town." She set her bag down, fatigue making her bold. "I can pay the going rate." The bartender scratched his jaw, considering. Around them, the tension in the room was palpable. A widow in a place like this. It upset the natural order of things. "Well," he said finally, "I do got one room, but there's a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Room's already taken. Fella paid for the week in advance." Rebecca's heart sank. Even here, at the bottom rung of respectability, she was to be turned away. "However," the bartender continued, "he ain't in town right now. Won't be back till tomorrow, maybe the day after. You could use it tonight, I suppose, long as you're gone when he returns." "That would be acceptable," Rebecca said quickly. "There's another thing." The bartender looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "Like I said, we ain't really set up for ladies here. That room, it's only got the one bed." The silence in the tavern was complete. Everyone waited to see how this proper widow would react to such an improper suggestion. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she was beyond caring about propriety. She needed shelter, needed rest, needed a door she could close against the world for just one night. She lifted her chin and met the bartender's eyes. "That's perfect." The words rang out clear and unmistakable in the smoky air. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone whistled low and appreciative. Another man pounded his table, laughing. The painted women exchanged glances, some amused, some pitying. "Well, I'll be damned," someone muttered. The bartender blinked, then shrugged. "Your funeral, ma'am. That'll be $2 for the night. Room's at the top of the stairs, last door on the right." Rebecca counted out the coins with steady hands, though inside she trembled. What had she just done? What would people think? But then she remembered Thomas, crushed in the dark, and the mine owner who'd walked away without consequence. She remembered the hotel clerks with their sneering faces, the boarding house matrons with their closed doors. Let them think what they wanted. She was done trying to fit into their narrow definitions of respectability. "I'll need a key," she said. The bartender handed it over wordlessly. Rebecca picked up her bag and made her way to the stairs, feeling every eye in the place following her progress. As she climbed, she heard the conversations resume below, her arrival already becoming part of the tavern's lore. The room, when she finally reached it, was small and spare. A single bed dominated the space, its iron frame and thin mattress a far cry from the brass bed she'd shared with Thomas. A washstand stood in the corner with a cracked pitcher and basin. The window looked out over the backs of buildings toward the endless prairie beyond. Rebecca set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. She had made it to Coyote Ridge, though for what purpose, she couldn't say. Thomas's cousin lived here somewhere, but finding him could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she had a roof over her head and a door she could lock. As darkness fell over the town, Rebecca lay down fully clothed on the narrow bed. Below, she could hear the sounds of the tavern, laughter, arguments, the clink of glasses. But up here, in this small room with its single bed, she found an unexpected peace. She had declared herself beyond their judgment, beyond their rules. "That's perfect," she whispered again to the darkness, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she meant it. Samuel Hayes sat in the corner of the dusty spur, nursing a whiskey he'd been working on for the better part of an hour. He'd positioned himself where he could see both the door and the stairs, an old habit from his cavalry days that he'd never shaken. The commotion when the widow entered had drawn his attention like everyone else's, but unlike the others, he'd watched with interest rather than amusement. He'd seen her type before, not the grieving widow part, but the steel underneath the proper exterior. During his years in the cavalry, fighting Apache and chasing outlaws across the territories, he'd encountered women who'd survived Indian raids, drought, and every other horror the frontier could devise. They had a particular way of holding themselves, back straight despite the weight they carried, eyes forward when lesser souls would look down. This one, though, she was different. When she'd said those two words, "That's perfect," in response to old Jake's warning about the single bed, Samuel had seen something flicker across her face. Not resignation, not desperation, but a kind of fierce determination to take whatever the world offered and make it work. He shifted slightly, his large frame making the chair creak. At 6'3", with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work, Samuel knew he cut an imposing figure. His dark hair, touched with premature gray at 35, hung a little too long beneath his worn hat. He hadn't shaved in 3 days, and his clothes bore the dust of a long ride from his ranch 10 miles outside town. The other patrons had gone back to their diversions, but Samuel found his gaze returning to the stairs. Jake had given her his room, the one he'd paid for in advance while he tended to business at neighboring ranches. He didn't mind. He could bed down in the stable with his horse Caesar. Wouldn't be the first time. "You gonna sit there mooning all night, Sam?" The voice belonged to Doris, one of the saloon girls who'd known him since he'd first arrived in Coyote Ridge 5 years ago. She slid into the chair across from him, her painted face showing genuine affection beneath the powder and rouge. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "About that widow? She's a pretty little thing, even in those mourning clothes." Doris signaled for a drink of her own. "Though she's got more guts than sense, taking a room here. Sometimes that's what it takes to survive." Doris studied him over her glass. "You always did have a soft spot for strays. Remember that 3-legged dog you nursed back to health, and that Mexican kid you taught to break horses? This is different." "Is it?" She leaned back, shrewd eyes assessing. "When's the last time you came to town, Sam? 3 weeks? A month? And suddenly you're here the same night as our mysterious widow." Samuel didn't answer. Truth was, he hadn't planned to be in town at all. He'd been heading to the Grafton spread to look at some horses when Caesar had thrown a shoe. By the time the blacksmith finished, it had been too late to make the journey. Pure coincidence that he'd been here to witness Rebecca Collins's arrival. He knew her name because he'd asked Jake quietly after she'd gone upstairs. Jake had seen it on the card she'd filled out, along with her previous address. Bisbee, Arizona Territory. Mining town. That explained the widow's weeds. "You know she'll bring trouble," Doris said softly. "Women like that always do. Too proper for the likes of us. Too independent for the respectable folk. She'll be caught in between, and anyone who helps her will be caught too." Samuel finished his whiskey in one swallow. "Maybe she's tired of being what others expect. Maybe you are too." Doris stood, patting his shoulder. "Just be careful, Sam. You've built something good out at that ranch. Don't throw it away for a pair of pretty eyes and a sad story." After she left, Samuel remained seated, watching the evening crowd ebb and flow. He thought about his ranch, the 100 head of cattle, the 2 hired hands who helped him work it. It wasn't much by Texas standards, but it was his, bought with saved cavalry pay, and built with his own hands. He'd come to Coyote Ridge to escape. The war memories, the expectations of his family back east, the ghosts that had followed him home from battles whose names still made him wake in cold sweats. The ranch had saved him. The hard work, the isolation, the simple rhythm of seasons and stock. He came to town only when necessary, avoiding entanglements, keeping to himself. It was a good life, a safe life. So why couldn't he stop thinking about the woman upstairs? Near midnight, the saloon began to empty. Samuel stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. He'd check on Caesar, then bed down in the stable as planned. But first, he climbed the stairs quietly, his boots finding the spots that didn't creak through long practice. At the end of the hall, a thin line of light showed beneath the door of his room. She was still awake then. Samuel paused outside, raising his hand to knock, then lowering it. What would he say? That he was the man whose room she'd taken? That he wanted to make sure she was safe? That something about her reminded him of his sister Catherine, who'd died of fever while he was away at war? Through the thin door, he heard movement, the scrape of a chair, footsteps, the splash of water. Such intimate sounds, reminding him of a life he'd once imagined for himself before the war changed everything. He turned to go, but the floorboard beneath his boot groaned loudly. The sounds inside the room stopped. "Who's there?" Her voice was steady, but he heard the fear underneath. Samuel cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm the one who rented this room, named Samuel Hayes. I just wanted to let you know you're welcome to it tonight. I'll be bunking elsewhere." Silence. Then the door opened a crack, held by a chain. One green eye peered out at him, taking in his size, his rough appearance, the gun on his hip. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "I appreciate your generosity. The bartender said you'd be away." "Got back early. No matter. I often sleep in the stable when I'm in town. Caesar, that's my horse. He's better company than most." The door opened a little wider, though the chain remained. He could see her better now. Auburn hair taken down from its pins, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders over what looked like a nightgown. She'd been preparing for bed when he'd disturbed her. "I'll pay you for the inconvenience," she offered. "No need. I heard you already paid Jake for the night." She studied him with those remarkable eyes, seeming to weigh his character in a glance. "You were downstairs when I arrived." It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. "Yes, ma'am." "You didn't laugh." "No, ma'am. Nothing funny about a woman needing shelter." Something in her face softened slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. That's very kind." "Just decent, ma'am. Nothing more." He touched the brim of his hat. "You need anything. Anyone bothers you, you holler. I'll hear it from the stable." "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Samuel considered the question. "Why indeed? Maybe because I know what it's like to be somewhere you don't fit, to have folks make up their minds about you before you even open your mouth." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were at the war." He stiffened. "How did you—" "The way you stand, the way you watch everything. My late husband, had a brother who came back from Shiloh. He had the same look." "Yes, ma'am. Cavalry. 5th Kansas. Confederate? Union." She nodded slowly. "That must be difficult here. Some days." He shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. "I should let you rest." "Mr. Hayes?" she called as he turned away. "What did you mean? About knowing what it's like not to fit?" He looked back at her, this small woman standing behind a chained door, asking questions that cut right to the bone. "I was raised in Boston, ma'am. Supposed to be a banker like my father. Supposed to marry a nice girl from a good family, have children, live in a brownstone, and never get my hands dirty." He gave a rueful smile. "Instead, I went to war, came west, and now I raise cattle and sleep in stables. My family considers me lost." "And are you? Lost?" "No, ma'am. For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I am." She smiled then, just a small curve of her lips, but it transformed her face. "Good night, Mr. Hayes. Good night, Mrs. Collins." He made it halfway down the stairs before her voice stopped him again. "Mr. Hayes, you said if anyone bothers me—" "Yes? Does that include the sheriff? He was in the saloon earlier watching me. I don't think he approves of my presence here." Samuel's jaw tightened. Sheriff Watson was a piece of work. Corrupt, brutal, and clever enough to hide it behind a badge. If he'd taken notice of the widow, it didn't bode well. "Especially the sheriff, ma'am. You have trouble with him, you find me." He left then, making his way through the now quiet saloon and out to the stable. Caesar nickered a greeting, and Samuel rubbed the stallion's neck absently. He spread his bedroll in an empty stall, but sleep was a long time coming. He thought about green eyes and auburn hair, about courage dressed in widow's weeds, about a woman who said, "That's perfect," when the world offered her scraps. Most of all, he thought about how, for the first time in 5 years, he wanted to be something more than just a man hiding from his past on a lonely ranch. The moon was setting when he finally dozed off. and his dreams were filled with the sound of a chain being drawn back from a door, and a voice asking if he was lost. The morning sun was barely cresting the horizon when Rebecca ventured out of the dusty spur, hoping to find Thomas's cousin before the town fully awakened. She dressed carefully in her most modest black dress, pinned her hair severely back, and tried to make herself as unremarkable as possible. It didn't work. She'd barely made it half a block before she felt the eyes. Curtains twitched in windows, women stopped their sweeping to stare, and men lounging outside the general store tracked her progress with predatory interest. The story of her arrival had already spread, growing in the telling. By now, she was probably a scarlet woman who'd demanded a room at the town's most notorious establishment and brazenly declared her satisfaction with improper sleeping arrangements. Mrs. Collins. The voice made her stop. Sheriff Watson stepped out from the shadow of the bank building, his star glinting in the early light. He was a thin man with cold gray eyes and a mouth that seemed perpetually pursed in disapproval. Everything about him was sharp. Sharp cheekbones, sharp nose, sharp creases in his perfectly pressed clothes. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, keeping her voice neutral. "Heard you caused quite a stir last night." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of pomade and something else. Ambition, perhaps, or cruelty given form. The dusty spur ain't no place for a respectable woman. It was the only establishment with available accommodation. Was it now? His smile was thin as paper. Funny thing that. I happen to know the Territorial Inn had 2 rooms empty last night. Mrs. Morrison at the boarding house also had space. Rebecca remained silent. What could she say? That they'd turned her away for being a young widow? That her very existence seemed to offend them? "See, Mrs. Collins, we run a respectable town here. We got standards, rules." He circled her slowly, like a coyote sizing up prey. "Widows who act proper, who know their place. Why? We take care of them. Find them honest work, maybe as a seamstress or schoolteacher. But widows who frequent saloons, who take rooms with single beds without batting an eye." "I've done nothing improper," Rebecca said firmly. "Haven't you?" He stopped directly in front of her, blocking her path. "You're new here, so I'll give you some free advice. Coyote Ridge ain't like those mining towns you're used to. We don't tolerate loose women or troublemakers. You want to stay here, you'll find appropriate lodgings and keep to yourself. Otherwise, his hand moved to rest on his gun belt. Otherwise, you might find Coyote Ridge an unfriendly place. Accidents happen. Women traveling alone disappear. You understand me." The threat hung between them like a loaded gun. Rebecca felt her heart racing but kept her expression calm. She'd learned in the weeks since Thomas's death that showing fear only encouraged such men. "I understand perfectly, Sheriff." "Good." He tipped his hat mockingly. "You have a pleasant day now, Mrs. Collins. And remember, I'll be watching." He strode away, leaving Rebecca standing in the street, her hands trembling slightly. She forced herself to continue walking, though every step felt like defiance. At the post office, she inquired about Thomas's cousin, James Collins, only to learn he'd left town 6 months ago, heading further west to California. Another door closed. The general store was her next stop. She needed supplies if she was to stay even another day, though where she'd go after that remained a mystery. The proprietor, Mr. Garrett, was a round man with mutton chops who looked at her as if she might steal something. "Help you?" he asked grudgingly. "I need some basic provisions. Coffee, hardtack, perhaps some—" "Cash only, no credit." "I didn't ask for credit." As she made her selections, she became aware of whispered conversations around her. 2 women with market baskets gave her a wide berth, pulling their skirts aside as if her reputation might be contagious. A group of men near the pickle barrel made no effort to lower their voices. "That's her, the widow from the Dusty Spur." "Heard she took Sam Hayes' room without a fuss." "That's perfect," she said, bold as brass. "Wonder what else she considers perfect." Their laughter followed her to the counter. Mr. Garrett tallied her purchases slowly, as if hoping she'd leave without them. When she paid, he made a show of examining each coin. "Your money's good, I suppose," he said finally. "But I'll ask you not to linger. This is a family establishment." Rebecca gathered her purchases and left, her cheeks burning. On the boardwalk, she nearly collided with a well-dressed matron leading two young children. The woman gasped and pulled her children behind her skirts. "The very idea," the woman hissed to her companion. "Parading around in daylight after spending the night in that den of iniquity." "Mother, who's that lady?" one of the children asked. "Nobody," the woman said firmly, hustling them away. "Nobody at all." Rebecca stood frozen, watching them go. Nobody. Is that what she'd become? In Bisbee, she'd been a miner's wife, respectable if poor. Now she was nobody, worse than nobody. A cautionary tale mothers would use to frighten their daughters into propriety. She turned down an alley, needing a moment away from the judging eyes, and found herself face to face with three men. They were rough-looking sorts, the kind who hired out for dirty work. One of them smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Well, the widow Collins. Heard you're looking for accommodations more suited to your tastes." "Excuse me." She tried to pass, but they spread out, blocking her way. "No need to be unfriendly," another said. "Sheriff Watson sent us to make you an offer. There's a place outside town, caters to women in your situation. You'd make good money, enough to move on to California or wherever." Rebecca understood immediately what kind of place they meant. Her stomach turned. "I'm not interested." "Come now, no need to play coy. Woman takes a room at the Dusty Spur. Everyone knows what that means." "It means I needed shelter," she said coldly. The first man's smile faded. "Sheriff says you got two choices. Take the offer or take the consequences. What'll it be?" Before Rebecca could respond, a shadow fell across the alley entrance. Samuel Hayes stood there, looking even larger than he had the night before. His hand rested casually on his gun, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Morning, gentlemen. Mrs. Collins." He nodded to her politely. "These men bothering you?" "Just having a friendly chat," the leader said, but his bravado had dimmed. "Didn't look friendly from where I stood." Samuel moved into the alley, and the three men instinctively backed up. "In fact, it looked like three men cornering a lady. Can't think of anything more cowardly. This ain't your business, Hayes." "I'm making it my business." His voice was quiet, dangerous. "Mrs. Collins, would you like me to escort you back to the Dusty Spur?" "That would be kind, Mr. Hayes." She moved past the three men, who parted reluctantly. Samuel fell into step beside her, his presence a shield against their hostile stares. They walked in silence until they reached the main street. "Thank you," she said quietly. "They won't give up," he warned. "Watson's got his teeth into something, and he's like a dog with a bone. You crossed him by not being ashamed, by not scurrying away like he expected." "What am I supposed to do? I have nowhere to go, no money to get there if I did." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You could work." "Where? You heard them. I'm a pariah. No respectable business will hire me now." "I meant at my ranch." The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. "I need someone who can cook, keep books. My last hand quit a month ago. Said it was too lonely. Room and board plus wages." Rebecca stopped walking. "Mr. Hayes, you don't know anything about me." "I know you're brave. I know you're in trouble through no fault of your own. I know Watson's got plans, and they likely involve more than just running you out of town." He met her eyes. "And I know what it's like to need a fresh start. People will talk. Your reputation—" "Ma'am, I'm a Union veteran in Confederate territory who refuses to attend church and reads books for pleasure. My reputation's already shot." Despite everything, Rebecca found herself almost smiling. "You're serious?" "Never more so. The ranch is 10 miles out, far enough from town that nobody bothers with it. You'd have your own room, with a bed to yourself," he added with a slight smile. "It's hard work, I won't lie, but it's honest." Rebecca looked back toward the alley where Watson's men had cornered her, then at the faces watching from windows and doorways. The choice seemed suddenly clear. When would I start? "How about now? I've got supplies to pick up, then we can head out. Unless you have belongings to collect? Just a carpetbag at the Dusty Spur. Then let's get it and go, before Watson decides to escalate matters." As they walked back to the saloon, Rebecca caught sight of Sheriff Watson standing outside his office. He touched his hat mockingly, and she saw his lips form words. "Remember, I'm watching." But for the first time since arriving in Coyote Ridge, she wasn't afraid. She had an ally now, unexpected as he was. And more than that, she had a purpose. Let Watson watch. Let the town gossip. She'd found her fresh start in the last place she'd expected, beside a quiet cowboy who understood the value of second chances. "Mr. Hayes?" she said as they reached the dusty spur. "Samuel," he corrected. "If we're going to be working together, might as well use first names." "Samuel, then. Why are you really doing this?" He considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful. "Maybe because I've been hiding out at that ranch for 5 years, telling myself I was healing. But sometimes healing means opening the door to let someone else in, even if it's complicated. Especially if it's complicated. Especially then." He held the saloon door open for her. "After you, Rebecca. Let's go scandalize the territory by having a widow work an honest job." As she passed him to enter the saloon, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope. It was a dangerous feeling in a dangerous time, but she held on to it anyway. After all, she'd already declared herself beyond their narrow definitions. What was one more act of defiance? The ranch house sat low against the horizon, weathered boards silvered by sun and wind. As the wagon crested the final hill, Rebecca got her first real look at what would be her new home. It was modest, a main house with a peaked roof, a barn that had seen better days, and a few outbuildings scattered like afterthoughts across the dusty yard. But there was something solid about it, something that spoke of permanence in a land where everything seemed temporary. "It's not much," Samuel said, perhaps reading disappointment in her silence. "It's perfect," Rebecca replied, and meant it. After weeks of closed doors and hostile faces, the isolation felt like sanctuary. Samuel pulled the wagon up to the house and helped her down. His hands were gentle despite their size, and he released her the moment her feet touched ground, stepping back to maintain proper distance. Even here, miles from watching eyes, he was careful of her reputation. "Your room's through here," he said, leading her inside. The main room was sparse but clean, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with books that surprised her. He noticed her looking. "Told you," I read. "One of my many sins according to town folk." The room he showed her was small but private, with a window overlooking the prairie. The bed, she noticed with a mixture of relief and irony, was narrow but solely hers. Someone had made an effort here. Clean curtains, a quilt that looked hand-stitched, a pitcher and basin decorated with tiny blue flowers. "This was meant for a housekeeper I hired from Denver," Samuel explained. "She took one look at the place and got back on the stage, said it was too lonesome." "I find lonesome peaceful," Rebecca said, setting down her carpet bag. That evening, she cooked her first meal in the ranch kitchen. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread with the last of the bacon. But Samuel ate it like it was a feast, and she realized he'd probably been living on his own rough cooking for weeks. "Tomorrow I'll show you the ledgers," he said, pushing back from the table. "Fair warning, they're a mess. Numbers aren't my strong suit." "I kept books for Thomas," she said, then stopped, surprised she'd mentioned her husband so easily. "Thomas was your husband?" "Yes, he died 3 months ago. Mine accident." She rose to clear the dishes, needing movement. "They said it was an accident." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "But you don't think so?" "I know it wasn't. He wrote me about the unsafe conditions, the rotting timbers. The owner, Mr. Holloway, wouldn't pay for repairs. Said it would cut into profits." Her hands stilled on the dishes. "After Thomas died, I tried to get the other miners to speak up, to demand an investigation. But Holloway owned the law there, just like Watson owns it here." "Is that why you left Bisbee?" "That and the eviction notice. Company housing is for workers' families. No worker, no house." She resumed washing, her movements sharp. "They gave me 3 days to leave." Behind her, she heard Samuel's chair scrape back. "I'm sorry. That's a hard thing. Hard things make us stronger, my mother used to say." She dried her hands, turning to face him. "Speaking of hard things, when I was packing my room at the dusty spur, I found something odd." She retrieved her carpet bag and pulled out a leather folder, weathered and water-stained. It was wedged beneath a loose floorboard. I wouldn't have noticed except my heel caught on the board when I was dressing. Samuel frowned, taking the folder. Inside were documents, land deeds, survey maps, and what looked like correspondence. His expression darkened as he read. These are property transfers, all dated within the last year, all selling to the same company, Watson Holdings, LLC. He looked up. That's Sheriff Watson's company. I knew he had business interests, but this... Look at the prices, Rebecca pointed out. They're all far below market value. And see here. She indicated a column of notes. Each seller had some kind of trouble right before selling. The Hendersons' well went dry. The Paulson family had their barn burned down. The Clearys lost their entire herd to disease. Too many coincidences. Samuel spread the papers on the table, studying them by lamplight. And look at this map. All these properties form a line, like a corridor. A corridor to what? He traced the path with his finger. If I'm reading this right, it leads from the town straight through to... Wait. He grabbed another paper. This is a survey report from the railroad company. They're planning a spur line through this exact area. Rebecca felt the pieces clicking together. Watson knows about the railroad. He's forcing people off their land cheap. Then he'll sell to the railroad for 10 times what he paid. More than that, with a railroad stop, Coyote Ridge would boom. These properties would be worth fortunes. Samuel's jaw tightened. No wonder he wants you gone. A widow with no connections, poking around where she shouldn't. We have to tell someone. Tell who? Watson is the law here. The nearest federal marshal is 100 miles away, and he'd need more than suspicious documents to act. Rebecca sank into a chair, deflated. It was Bisbee all over again. Corruption protected by isolation and indifference. Then she noticed another document tucked behind the others. Samuel, look at this. It was a letter, dated just 2 weeks ago. Watson, the timeline has moved up. Railroad announcement next month. Need remaining property secured immediately. Use whatever means necessary. Burn them out if you have to. J.H., Samuel muttered. Why do those initials? His face went pale. James Holloway. He's a big investor in town, owns the bank and half the commercial buildings. Holloway? Rebecca gripped the table. That was my husband's mine owner, the one who let him die rather than pay for safety repairs. They stared at each other across the lamplight. The coincidence was too great. Somehow, the man who'd killed her husband was connected to the corruption here. He must have investments all over the territory, Samuel said slowly. Uses the same tactics everywhere. Squeeze the little people, take their property, leave them with nothing. Or leave them dead. Rebecca's voice was bitter. They sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Finally, Samuel carefully refolded the documents. You realize what this means. You've stumbled onto something that could bring down some very powerful men. They won't let that happen. Then we'd better be careful. We. He looked at her steadily. Rebecca, this isn't your fight. I can get you to another town, give you enough money to start fresh somewhere they've never heard of Watson or Holloway. And let them keep doing this? Let them destroy more families. She shook her head. I ran from Bisbee because I had no choice. But I'm tired of running. Thomas died because men like Holloway value profit over lives. How many others will die if we do nothing? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The first time he'd touched her intentionally since helping her from the wagon. His palm was rough with calluses, but warm. You're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. She turned her hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. But I can't do it alone. You won't be alone. His grip tightened slightly. We'll need help, though. There are others who've been hurt by Watson. The Hendersons are still in the area, working as hired hands. Old Pete Cleary drinks at the Dusty Spur most nights, talking about his lost herd. If we could get them together, show them these documents. Would they listen to us? A Union veteran and a scandalous widow? Maybe not at first. But Pete Cleary's son died at Chancellorsville, fighting for the Union. He's never held my service against me. And Martha Henderson doesn't care about reputation. She cares about getting justice for her family. They talked late into the night, sitting close together at the rough table, planning carefully. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind whispered secrets through the gaps in the boards. Finally, Rebecca yawned, exhaustion catching up with her. I should rest. Tomorrow. Tomorrow we start fighting back. Samuel stood, suddenly seeming to realize he was still holding her hand. He released it, stepping back. "Rebecca, thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me that hiding isn't healing. That sometimes you have to stand up, even when it's dangerous." She rose, standing close to him in the lamplight. "Thomas used to say courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear." "Smart man, your Thomas." "He was." She smiled sadly. "I think he would have liked you." Samuel walked her to her door, maintaining careful distance again. But before she entered, he spoke once more. "Rebecca, that bed in there, it's just yours, but you're not alone in this house, or in this fight. Remember that." She looked back at him, this large, gentle man who'd offered her sanctuary, and was now offering to share her danger. "That's perfect," she said softly, echoing her words from that first night. As she closed her door, Rebecca touched the documents they'd hidden in her room. Somewhere out there, Watson and Holloway were planning their next move, confident in their power. They had no idea that in a small ranch house 10 miles from town, their carefully laid plans were about to unravel. She lay down on her narrow bed, fully clothed as had become her habit, listening to Samuel's footsteps move through the house, checking locks, banking the fire. Such ordinary sounds, yet they spoke of safety, of not being alone. Tomorrow, they would begin gathering allies. Tomorrow, the fight would truly begin. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas's death, Rebecca Collins fell asleep without fear, knowing that in the next room was a man who understood that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. The Henderson farm sat in a hollow between two hills, protected from the worst of the wind, but not from misfortune. As Samuel's wagon rolled up the dusty track, Rebecca could see the signs of decline, fences that needed mending, a garden plot gone to seed, the general air of people just barely holding on. Martha Henderson emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Her expression was wary until she recognized Samuel. "Sam Hayes," she called. "What brings you out this way?" Her eyes found Rebecca, and with company. "Martha, this is Rebecca Collins. She's working as my bookkeeper. We've come to talk to you and Bill about something important." Martha's weathered face showed curiosity mixed with caution. "Bill's in the back field. Come in, I'll send the boy for him." The Henderson kitchen was clean but spare, everything mended and remended until fixing was no longer possible. Martha poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on the stove, the brew thick and bitter. "Times have been hard since we lost the homestead," Martha said, setting out cups with a defiant pride that dared them to pity her. "But we're managing." Bill Henderson arrived shortly, a tall man bent by worry and work. Dust settled into the lines of his face like a permanent reminder of what they'd lost. He shook Samuel's hand, nodded politely to Rebecca, then sat heavily at the table. "We need to show you something," Samuel said, producing the documents they'd carefully copied, keeping the originals hidden at the ranch. "But first, I need your word that what we discussed doesn't leave this room unless we all agree." The Hendersons exchanged glances. "You've got it," Bill said slowly. For the next hour, Rebecca and Samuel laid out what they'd discovered. They showed the pattern of property transfers, the below-market prices, the two convenient disasters that preceded each sale. Martha's face grew harder with each revelation, while Bill's hands clenched and unclenched on the scarred table. "Our well didn't just go dry," Martha said when they finished. "I told everyone who'd listen it was poisoned. Found dead rabbits near it first, then the water turned brackish. But Watson said we had no proof, said we must have done something wrong ourselves." "The Cleary's herd didn't die of disease either," Bill added. "Pete told me the cattle were fine one day, dead the next. No fever, no symptoms, just dead." "And the Paulson barn?" Rebecca asked. "Tom Paulson swears he saw riders that night just before the fire started. But Watson said he was drunk, couldn't trust his word." Bill's voice was bitter. "Funny how Watson was first on the scene, offering to buy the land for enough to start over somewhere else." Samuel spread out the railroad survey map. "This is why. Every property they've forced out lies along this route. When the railroad announces the spur line next month, Watson and his partners will make fortunes." Martha stood abruptly, pacing to the window. What good does knowing do us? Watson owns the law. Holloway owns the bank. They've got the power. Knowledge is its own kind of power, Rebecca said quietly. In Bisbee, my husband died because the mine owner cut corners on safety. I couldn't get justice because I was one voice against their money and influence. But if all the families they've cheated stand together, you're talking about taking on the most powerful men in the territory, Bill warned. They've already shown they'll burn folks out, poison wells. What else might they do? What else can they take from us? Martha turned from the window, fire in her eyes. We've already lost everything. Living as hired hands on land we used to own, watching our children go hungry while those men get fat on their schemes. A knock at the door interrupted them. Everyone tensed until a familiar voice called out, "Martha, it's Pete Cleary. Saw Hayes' wagon outside." Pete Cleary was a small, wiry man with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years looking into the sun. He'd aged a decade in the years since losing his herd, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been robust. "Pete," Bill said, opening the door. "Come in. You need to hear this." They went through the story again, watching Pete's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, a cold fury. "I knew it," he said when they finished. "I knew those cattle didn't just die. 30 head, healthy as you please, then suddenly they're all dead? And Watson just happens to show up with an offer?" He spat into the fireplace. "My boy died fighting for this country, and this is what I get? Cheated by carpetbaggers and criminals?" "We need more than anger," Samuel said carefully. "We need evidence, more documents, witnesses willing to speak up. And we need to be smart about it. If Watson suspects we're organizing against him..." "There are others," Martha said suddenly. "The Kowalskis, the Martins, the widow Chen, all forced to sell in the last 2 years. Most have moved on, but some are still around, working the mines or hiring out for day labor." Rebecca pulled out a notebook. "We should make a list. Everyone who's been forced out, where they are now if you know. Any details about what happened to them?" For the next hour, they compiled names and stories. The pattern became clearer with each edition. Watson and his associates had been systematically clearing the future railroad route, using whatever means necessary. "The Kowalskis might still have papers," Pete offered. "Jan never throws anything away. They're working at the Grafton spread now, about 15 miles north." "I can reach out to the Martins," Martha said. "Lucy Martin and I still correspond. They're in Tucson now, but they might have kept evidence." "What about the law?" Bill asked. "The federal marshal in Prescott would need solid proof before riding 100 miles to take on a local sheriff," Samuel finished. "But if we can build a strong enough case with enough witnesses..." "We'd need someone respectable to present it," Rebecca said realistically. "A Union veteran and a widow who stays at the Dusty Spur won't carry much weight." "What about Judge Thorne?" Pete suggested. "He's retired now, lives outside town, but he's got no love for Watson. They clashed when Thorne was still on the bench." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Thorne's a possibility. He's got the legal knowledge and the reputation. Question is whether he'd risk getting involved." "Only one way to find out," Rebecca said. As they prepared to leave, Martha pulled Rebecca aside. "You've got spine, girl. Not many would take this on, especially someone in your position." "My position is exactly why I have to," Rebecca replied. "I've already lost everything to men like Holloway and Watson. I've got nothing left to lose but my life, and that's not much of a life if I spend it running." Martha squeezed her shoulder. "You need anything. Supplies, a place to hide if things go bad. You come here. We may not have much, but we share what we've got." The sun was setting as Samuel and Rebecca headed back to the ranch, the documents carefully hidden beneath the wagon seat. They'd stopped at 2 more homesteads, finding similar stories of loss and intimidation. The network of victims was larger than they'd imagined. "You did well today," Samuel said as they rode. "People trusted you, opened up to you. They recognized a fellow sufferer," Rebecca said simply. "Sometimes that's all it takes." They were about 5 miles from the ranch when Samuel suddenly tensed. "We've got company." Rebecca looked back to see 3 riders following at a distance, making no effort to close the gap, but clearly tracking them. Her heart began to race. "Watson's men?" "Most likely. testing us, seeing where we go, who we talk to. Samuel kept his voice calm, but his hand moved to check his rifle. They won't try anything yet. Too many people saw us today. But this is a warning. Should we go somewhere else? Not lead them to the ranch? They already know where I live. Best thing is to act normal, like we've got nothing to hide. He glanced at her. You scared? Terrified, Rebecca admitted. But also angry. They think they can intimidate us into silence, just like they did all the others. That's the spirit that's going to see us through this. The riders followed them all the way to the ranch road, then stopped at the boundary marker. One of them, Rebecca recognized him from the alley in town, touched his hat mockingly before they turned and rode away. Inside the house, Samuel immediately checked all the windows and doors, his military training evident in his methodical movements. From now on, we need to be more careful. No traveling alone, always armed, always watching. Samuel, Rebecca said quietly, maybe I should leave. If something happens to you because of me. Stop. He turned to face her, crossing the room in 3 strides. You're not going anywhere. We're in this together now, remember? Besides, his expression softened slightly. The ranch has been too quiet for too long. Even with the danger, these last few days have felt more like living than the last 5 years. Rebecca looked up at him, struck by how natural it felt to stand close to this man she'd known less than a week. Thomas would have liked you, she said again. He believed in standing up for what's right no matter the cost. And you? What do you believe in? I believe. She paused, considering. I believe that sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be, even if it's not where we planned. I believe that good people finding each other in hard times is its own kind of miracle. Samuel's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Rebecca. A sharp crack split the air. The window behind them exploded in a shower of glass. Samuel threw himself over Rebecca, bearing her to the floor as another shot splintered the door frame. Stay down, he commanded, crawling toward his rifle. 2 more shots rang out, then silence. They waited, hearts pounding for what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Samuel risked a look through the shattered window. They're gone. This was just a message. He helped Rebecca sit up, checking her for injuries. Are you hurt? No, I'm fine. Her voice shook only slightly. So much for acting normal. Samuel's expression was grim as he surveyed the damage. They're escalating faster than I expected. We need to move quickly, get our evidence to Judge Thorne before... He was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching fast. Both tensed, then relaxed slightly as they recognized Pete Cleary's voice calling out. Hayes, Mrs. Collins, you in there? Samuel opened the door cautiously. Pete and 2 other men Rebecca didn't recognize sat their horses in the yard, all armed. We heard shots from the Baxter place, Pete explained. Figured you might need help. Watson's men, Samuel confirmed. Warning shots, mostly. Maybe not just a warning, one of the other men said. The Grafton spread is burning, started about an hour ago. The Kowalskis were staying in the bunkhouse there. Rebecca felt her blood run cold. The Kowalskis, the ones who might have kept papers. Are they? Got out safe, but barely. Lost everything they had left. Pete's face was granite. Watson's not playing anymore. He knows something's stirring. Samuel looked at the assembled men, then at Rebecca. Then we stopped playing too. Pete, can you get word to everyone we talked to today? Tell them to be on guard, travel in groups, and if anyone has evidence hidden away, now's the time to bring it forward. What are you going to do? First thing tomorrow, we're going to see Judge Thorne. It's time to make this official before anyone else gets hurt. As the men rode away to spread the word, Samuel and Rebecca worked to board up the broken window. The house felt different now. No longer a sanctuary, but a fortress under siege. I should have known, Samuel said bitterly. I should have expected they'd strike back hard. You couldn't have known they'd burn out an entire ranch, Rebecca countered. This just proves how desperate they are. They're making mistakes, getting sloppy, or getting ready for something big. If that railroad announcement is coming soon. They finished their work in silence, both lost in thought. The stakes had suddenly become very real. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. Later, as Rebecca lay in her narrow bed listening to Samuel pace the main room on watch, she thought about the price of standing up. The Kowalskis had lost their last possessions. The Hendersons lived in fear. She and Samuel had made themselves targets. But she also thought about Thomas, crushed in the dark while Holloway counted his profits, about all the families destroyed by greed, about the cycle that would continue unless someone said, "Enough." Through the thin walls, she heard Samuel pause in his pacing. "Rebecca, you awake?" "Yes. I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow or the day after, I'm glad you found that room at the Dusty Spur. I'm glad you're here." "So am I," she whispered back. "So am I." Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind carried the faint smell of smoke from the still-burning Grafton spread. The battle lines had been drawn. Tomorrow, they would take their evidence to Judge Thorne and hope that justice still had a place in this harsh land. But tonight they kept watch together, two souls united by circumstance and choice, preparing for a fight that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone who'd been crushed beneath the wheels of powerful men's ambitions. The night pressed against the boarded windows like a living thing, heavy with threat and the acrid smell of distant smoke. Rebecca had given up pretending to sleep, instead sitting at the kitchen table with the documents spread before her, organizing them by date and victim. Samuel maintained his vigil by the door, rifle across his knees, occasionally moving to check different windows. Near midnight, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Samuel motioned for Rebecca to take cover behind the overturned table he'd positioned earlier. But instead of another attack, they heard Judge Thorne's distinctive voice. "Hayes, open up, man. It's Marcus Thorne." Samuel cautiously opened the door to reveal the judge, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, accompanied by Pete Cleary and two other armed men. "Judge," Samuel said, surprised, "we were planning to come see you in the morning." Morning might be too late. Thorne dismounted, his movements still spry despite his age. "Word travels fast. I heard about the Grafton spread and about the shots fired here. May I come in?" Once inside, Thorne's sharp gaze took in the boarded window, the defensive preparations, and Rebecca emerging from behind the table. "Mrs. Collins, I presume. Your arrival has certainly stirred the hornet's nest." "The hornets were already stirring, Judge," Rebecca replied. "I just happened to step into their path." "Indeed." Thorne accepted the coffee Samuel offered and settled at the table. "Pete here tells me you've found evidence of a land grab scheme. I'd like to see it." For the next hour, Rebecca walked the judge through their discoveries, her bookkeeper's mind presenting the information clearly and logically. Thorne listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or examining a particular document more closely. "This is damning," he said finally. "The pattern is undeniable, but Watson will claim these are all legitimate sales, that any misfortunes beforehand were coincidental." "What about this?" Rebecca produced the letter signed J.H. "This explicitly mentions using force." Thorne studied it carefully. "Better, but still not enough on its own. Holloway will claim it's forged or taken out of context. We need witnesses willing to testify, preferably someone who heard Watson or Holloway give direct orders for violence." "The men who burned the Grafton spread," Samuel began, "are probably halfway to Mexico by now, if Watson has any sense." Thorne rubbed his temples. "No, we need someone from the inside, someone close to Watson who might be convinced to turn." Rebecca remembered something. "At the Dusty Spur, there's a woman named Doris. She seemed to know everyone and everything. If anyone's overheard Watson's plans—" "Doris McKenna?" Thorne nodded. "She's been at the Spur for 15 years, keeps her ears open and her mouth shut, which is why she's survived so long. But convincing her to testify—" "I could talk to her?" Rebecca offered. "No." Samuel's response was immediate and firm. "You're not going back to town alone, especially not to the Spur. Watson's men are watching for you." "Then I'll go with her," Judge Thorne said unexpectedly. "An old man visiting the saloon for a drink won't raise suspicions, and my presence might give Mrs. Collins some protection." They debated the plan until the early hours. finally agreeing that Thorne and Rebecca would go to town while Samuel and the others gathered more witnesses from the outlying farms. Speed was essential. If Watson felt cornered, he might accelerate whatever plans he had. As dawn broke pale and dusty, they prepared to leave. Samuel pulled Rebecca aside while the others readied the horses. "I don't like this," he said quietly. "Splitting up feels wrong. We need Doris's testimony, and with Judge Thorne there—" "I know." He gripped her shoulders gently. "Just be careful. I've gotten used to having you around." Rebecca reached up to touch his face, feeling the stubble beneath her fingers. "Just for a few days?" "No." His voice was rough. "For longer than that, for as long as you'll stay." Before she could respond, he bent his head and kissed her, a brief, fierce pressing of lips that spoke of fear and hope and promises yet unmade. Then he stepped back, collecting himself. "Go on, before I change my mind and lock you in that room with a single bed." "That's perfect," she whispered, echoing their beginning, and saw him almost smile. The ride to town with Judge Thorne was tense but uneventful. The judge proved to be excellent company, regaling her with stories of his circuit riding days while keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. "Samuel Hayes is a good man," he said as they neared Coyote Ridge. "I've watched him these 5 years, hiding out at that ranch. War broke something in him, but you seem to be mending it." "He's mending me too," Rebecca admitted. "I came here running from grief and injustice. He's helping me stand and fight instead." "Good. That's what partnership should be. 2 people making each other stronger." The town was oddly quiet as they rode down Main Street. Curtains twitched at their passing, but the usual bustle of morning commerce was subdued. Outside the sheriff's office, Watson stood with several deputies, watching their approach with cold eyes. "Morning, Judge," Watson called out. "Heard you were keeping irregular company these days." "I keep company with justice, Sheriff," Thorne replied calmly. "As I always have." Watson's gaze shifted to Rebecca. "Mrs. Collins, surprised to see you back in town. Thought you'd found accommodations elsewhere." "I had business to conduct," Rebecca said, proud when her voice didn't shake. "Business at the Dusty Spur, no doubt." Watson's smile was thin. "That's becoming quite a habit for you." They didn't respond, continuing to the saloon. Inside, the morning crowd was sparse. A few cowboys sleeping off the previous night's excesses, Jake the bartender wiping down surfaces that would only get dirty again. "Judge Thorne," Jake said, surprised. "And Mrs. Collins. Didn't expect to see either of you." "Is Doris available?" Thorne asked. "I'd like to buy her a drink and catch up on old times." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded toward the stairs. "Room 3. She's probably awake by now." They climbed the familiar stairs, Rebecca remembering her first night here. How scandalous it had seemed to take a room with 1 bed, how that simple act of defiance had changed everything. Doris answered their knock wrapped in a faded silk robe, her painted face showing surprise. "Judge and the widow Collins, this is an unexpected social call." "May we come in?" Thorne asked. "We need your help, Doris." Her room was larger than the one Rebecca had stayed in, decorated with remnants of better times. Velvet curtains, a brass mirror, photographs of a younger Doris with a handsome man in uniform. "My husband," Doris said, noticing Rebecca's gaze, "died at Gettysburg. I came west to start over, ended up here." She lit a cigarette with steady hands. "So, what help could an old saloon girl possibly provide to such respectable folks?" Thorne explained their situation concisely, ending with their need for witness testimony about Watson's schemes. Doris listened without expression, occasionally tapping ash into a painted dish. "You're asking me to sign my own death warrant," she said finally. "Watson owns this town. Cross him, and I'll end up in an arroyo with a bullet in my back." "We're trying to stop him," Rebecca said earnestly, "to get justice for all the families he's destroyed." "Justice," Doris laughed bitterly. "Honey, I've been in this business 15 years. Justice is what rich men call it when they win." "Then help us change that," Rebecca pressed. "You knew Samuel was a good man, told him to be careful about helping me. You see what Watson is. Help us stop him." Doris studied her for a long moment. "You really believe you can take down Watson and Holloway? With some papers and a few testimonies?" "We have to try." "My husband said that at Gettysburg." We have to try. They sent his effects home in a canvas bag. Doris crushed out her cigarette. But he'd hate what I've become, staying silent while evil men prosper. She stood abruptly, moving to a small safe hidden behind a painting. I've kept insurance over the years, little things overheard, documents left carelessly around. Never thought I'd use them, but... She pulled out a leather portfolio, handing it to Judge Thorne. Correspondence between Watson and Holloway. Records of payments to the men who burned the Paulson barn. A list of future targets, including your ranch, Hayes. Thorne's eyes widened as he examined the contents. Doris, this is... How did you... Watson gets careless when he drinks, and he likes to brag to women he thinks don't matter. Her smile was sharp. 15 years of being invisible has its advantages. Will you testify? Rebecca asked. In court? Stand up in front of the whole town. Doris considered. Yes, I think I will. But we'll need protection. Watson won't let this go to trial if he can help it. Heavy boots on the stairs interrupted them. Without warning, the door burst open. Sheriff Watson stood there with 3 deputies, guns drawn. Well, conspiracy in action. Watson's eyes were cold as winter. Judge, I'm disappointed. And Doris, after all these years... You can't arrest us for talking, Thorne said calmly. Can't I? Conspiracy to defame a public official, spreading seditious lies, disturbing the peace. Watson smiled. I'm sure I can think of more charges by the time we reach the jail. One of the deputies reached for the portfolio in Thorne's hands. The judge pulled back, and suddenly the room exploded into motion. Watson struck Thorne with his pistol butt, sending the older man to his knees. A deputy grabbed for Rebecca, but Doris smashed a whiskey bottle across his head. Run! Doris shouted, pushing Rebecca toward the window. Backstairs! Rebecca grabbed the portfolio as Judge Thorne struggled to his feet. Together, they stumbled onto the narrow balcony that ran along the building's rear. Below, more of Watson's men were already gathering. This way! Doris led them along the balcony to where it connected with the neighboring building. They could hear Watson shouting orders behind them. They made it to the feed store's roof access before the deputies caught up. Rebecca turned to see Watson himself leading the chase, his face twisted with fury. It's over, Watson, Judge Thorne called out, blood streaming from his temple but his voice steady. Too many people know. You can't silence us all. Watch me, Watson snarled, raising his gun. The shot was impossibly loud in the morning air, but it wasn't Watson who fired. From the street below, Samuel Hayes stood with his rifle shouldered, smoke curling from the barrel. Watson's gun flew from his hand as he cursed and clutched his bleeding fingers. The next one won't be a warning, Samuel called up. Behind him, Pete Cleary and a dozen other armed men spread out, covering the deputies. Watson looked around, calculating odds. The commotion had drawn townspeople from their homes and businesses. They stood watching, no longer hiding behind curtains. Martha Henderson was there, and the Kowalskis, and others who'd been driven from their lands. Even some who hadn't been directly affected stood witness, tired of living under Watson's thumb. This isn't over, Watson spat. Holloway has judges, governors. You think this little rebellion matters? It matters to us, Rebecca said quietly, but her voice carried in the morning stillness. And that's enough. Watson retreated with his wounded hand and his deputies, leaving them on the roof. As Rebecca helped Judge Thorne down, she felt the portfolio's weight, evidence that could finally bring justice. Samuel met them at the bottom, pulling Rebecca into a fierce embrace. When I heard the shots, I'm all right. We're all right. She pulled back to look at him. Doris has evidence, real evidence. We can stop them. Then let's finish this, he said. As they made their way through the crowd, Rebecca noticed something had changed. People met their eyes, nodded acknowledgement. The fear that had gripped Coyote Ridge was breaking, replaced by something more powerful. Hope. That night, in the ranch house with its boarded windows and bullet-scarred walls, they gathered to plan their next move. Judge Thorne, head bandaged but spirits high, would ride to Prescott at dawn to file official charges. The Hendersons and others would guard the evidence, copies distributed for safety. And Rebecca and Samuel would prepare for whatever retaliation came. But first, as the others bedded down in the main room for safety, Samuel walked Rebecca to her door. Today, when I heard those shots, when I thought—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I know," she said softly. "I thought the same when we were trapped on that roof." He cupped her face in his hands. "Rebecca Collins, you've turned my quiet life upside down, made me care about things beyond my ranch and my solitude, made me want things I'd given up on." "What things?" she whispered. "A future, a partner, someone to share that narrow bed with, scandalous as that might be." She laughed, surprising them both. "Mr. Hayes, are you proposing impropriety?" "I'm proposing everything," he said seriously. "When this is over, when Watson and Holloway face justice, I want you to stay. Not as my bookkeeper or my fellow conspirator, but as my wife. If you'll have a broken-down ex-soldier with more cattle than sense." Rebecca thought of Thomas, who would want her to find happiness again. She thought of the long journey that had brought her here, to this moment, this man, this choice. "That's perfect," she said, and kissed him as the moon rose over the prairie, casting silver light through the damaged windows of their embattled sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Watson wouldn't give up easily, and Holloway's reach was long. But tonight, in this house scarred by bullets but filled with determination, Rebecca Collins and Samuel Hayes held each other and planned for a future worth fighting for. The single bed in Rebecca's room remained empty that night as she stayed in Samuel's protective embrace in the main room, surrounded by allies who'd become family. It no longer mattered what the town thought. They'd moved beyond scandal to something more important, standing together against injustice, no matter the cost. And that, Rebecca thought as she drifted toward sleep, was truly perfect. The town hall hadn't seen such a crowd since its dedication 10 years prior. Every bench was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. Word had spread like wildfire through the valley. Today, the truth would be told. Rebecca stood near the front, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. She wore her best dress, the black of mourning replaced by a deep blue that Thomas had once said matched her spirit. Samuel stood beside her, solid and reassuring, his presence a reminder that she no longer faced her battles alone. Judge Thorne had returned from Prescott with a federal marshal and warrants, but more importantly, he'd brought something else, a territorial prosecutor willing to hear their case publicly before any arrests were made. It was irregular, but Thorne had argued successfully that the people deserved to know the truth about what had been done to them. Watson sat at a table with his lawyer, a slick man from Denver who kept whispering in his ear. The sheriff's wounded hand was bandaged, and his usual swagger had been replaced by something more dangerous, the cornered fury of a man who'd never expected to be challenged. Holloway hadn't appeared, sending word through his lawyer that he was traveling on business. But Rebecca noticed several of his associates in the crowd, their faces grim as they watched their carefully constructed scheme threaten to unravel. "This informal hearing will now come to order," Judge Thorne announced, having agreed to preside despite his involvement in recent events. "We are here to examine evidence of systematic land fraud and violence in Coyote Ridge and surrounding areas." The prosecutor, a young man named William Garrett, who seemed as eager to make his mark, stood to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you will hear today may shock you. It reveals a conspiracy that goes to the very heart of our community's leadership." Watson's lawyer immediately objected. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. My client hasn't been formally charged." "Your client is free to leave at any time," Thorne replied calmly. "But I suspect he'll want to hear what evidence we have before deciding his next move." Rebecca was called first to present the documents. She walked to the front with the portfolio, her voice clear as she began explaining what they'd found. She showed the pattern of forced sales, the correspondence between conspirators, the surveys showing the planned railroad route. "Every family that lost their land," she said, holding up the map, "lost it along this line. That's no coincidence. That's a plan." The crowd murmured, people recognizing their own properties, their neighbors' losses. Watson's face remained impassive, but she saw his good hand clench on the table. Next came the witnesses. Martha Henderson testified about their poisoned well, her voice strong despite her tears. Pete Cleary described finding his cattle dead, all 30 head in a single night. One by one, the dispossessed told their stories, painting a picture of systematic terror and theft. But it was Doris who provided the most damaging testimony. She entered the hall in a respectable gray dress, her face scrubbed clean of paint, looking nothing like the saloon girl most knew. The crowd whispered at her transformation. "State your name for the record," Garrett prompted. "Doris McKenna. I've worked at the Dusty Spur Saloon for 15 years. And in that capacity, did you overhear conversations between Sheriff Watson and others regarding land acquisitions?" "I did." Doris's voice was steady. "Sheriff Watson often conducted business in the private rooms. He thought we girls were too stupid or too scared to pay attention." "What did you hear?" Doris pulled out a small notebook. "I kept records, dates, times, conversations. On March 15th, Watson told Josiah Briggs to make sure the Henderson well never gives water again. On April 2nd, he paid 2 men $50 each to drive diseased cattle onto the Cleary Ranch." The crowd erupted. Watson shot to his feet. "This is slander. The word of a prostitute." "A working woman who kept better records than you thought," Doris shot back. "Including this." She produced a piece of paper. "A telegram from Holloway authorizing, and I quote, whatever measures necessary to clear the eastern parcels by month's end." Watson lunged across the space, but Samuel and 2 other men restrained him. His lawyer tried to restore order, shouting about procedural violations and tainted evidence. "There's more," Rebecca said once quiet was restored. She'd saved the most damning evidence for last. "Mr. Cleary, would you please bring in Mr. Briggs?" The crowd parted as Pete Cleary entered with Josiah Briggs, one of Watson's deputies who'd been arrested by the federal marshal that morning. Briggs looked terrified, his face pale and sweating. "Mr. Briggs has agreed to testify in exchange for leniency," Garrett announced. "Mr. Briggs, please tell us about the night of June 10th. Briggs's voice shook. "Watson sent me and 2 others to the Paulson place. We were supposed to make it look like an accident, but Tom Paulson saw us, so we had to burn the barn with him inside." The hall exploded. Tom Paulson's widow screamed. Men shouted for immediate justice. Watson tried to run but was tackled by a group of ranchers. "Order!" Thorne banged his gavel repeatedly. "Marshal, arrest Sheriff Watson on charges of conspiracy, arson, and murder." As the marshal moved to comply, Watson managed to break free for a moment. He pulled a hidden derringer, aiming wildly at Rebecca. "You destroyed everything." The shot rang out, but Samuel had already moved, shoving Rebecca aside. The bullet grazed his shoulder as he bore Watson to the ground. This time, the marshal's shackles held. "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak in defense of Sheriff Watson?" Thorne asked once order was restored. Silence. Even Watson's former deputies looked away. "Then let the record show." "Wait." A voice from the back interrupted. James Holloway entered, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers. Unlike Watson's desperate fury, Holloway exuded cold control. "I believe this kangaroo court has gone far enough." "Mr. Holloway," Thorne said evenly, "how good of you to join us. We have several questions." "I'm sure you do. However, I've come to make a statement." Holloway moved to the front, his presence commanding attention. "Sheriff Watson clearly exceeded his authority. I had no knowledge of any violence or illegal activities." "We have documents with your signature," Rebecca said, standing despite Samuel's protective hand on her arm. "Forgeries, no doubt, or taken out of context." Holloway's smile was thin. "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Collins. I buy land when opportunities arise. If sellers were motivated by unfortunate circumstances, that's hardly my fault." "You killed my husband," Rebecca said quietly, and the hall fell silent. "Maybe not here, but in Bisbee. You let those mine timbers rot rather than spend money on safety. Thomas and 12 others died for your profit margins." "Accidents happen in mining," Holloway replied dismissively. "Your husband knew the risks." "Just like accidents happen to every family along that railroad route?" Rebecca pulled out one final document. "This is a report from a Pinkerton detective you hired to investigate obstacles to land acquisition. His recommendations include poisoning wells, spreading disease among livestock, and strategic fires." Holloway's composure finally cracked. "Where did you get that?" "From your own files. Did you really think burning the Grafton spread would destroy all evidence? The Kowalskis saved more than you realized. The federal prosecutor stepped forward. James Holloway, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering across territorial lines. As the marshal moved in, Holloway's lawyers protested loudly about jurisdiction and procedure. But the crowd's mood had turned dangerous. These were people who'd lost everything to Holloway's greed, and they wanted justice. "Let the law handle him," Samuel called out, his voice carrying over the anger. "We're better than lynch mob justice. We're proving that today." Judge Thorne gavelled for order one final time. "This hearing has revealed extensive criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of our community. Federal authorities will continue the investigation, but let me say this clearly. The reign of terror in Coyote Ridge is over." The crowd erupted in cheers. Families who'd lost their lands embraced. Martha Henderson wept openly as she realized they might get their homestead back. Pete Cleary shook hands with anyone near him, years of bitterness finally finding release. Rebecca found herself surrounded by grateful families, all thanking her for her courage in revealing the truth. But she broke away to find Samuel, who was having his shoulder tended by Doc Morrison. "Just a graze," the doctor pronounced. "You'll live to fight another day." "No more fighting," Samuel said, catching Rebecca's hand. "I think we've had enough of that." Watson and Holloway were led away in shackles, Watson cursing and threatening while Holloway maintained stony silence. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. The railroad announcement would come, but the land would belong to its rightful owners, not the men who'd tried to steal it. Doris approached them as the crowd began to disperse. "Never thought I'd see this day," she said softly. "Watson behind bars, the truth finally told." "What will you do now?" Rebecca asked. "Judge Thorne offered me a job as court recorder. Seems my skill at keeping records is worth something after all." She smiled, looking younger without the paint and cynicism. "Maybe it's time I tried respectability." As the sun set over Coyote Ridge, Samuel and Rebecca stood on the courthouse steps, watching the town transform. Already displaced families were making plans to reclaim their lands. The shadow that had hung over the valley was lifting. "You did it," Samuel said, pulling her close with his good arm. "You brought down two of the most powerful men in the territory." "We did it," Rebecca corrected. "All of us together. What now? The ranch seems too quiet for a woman who takes on corruption and wins." Rebecca smiled, thinking of the letter she'd received that morning. "Actually, the territorial prosecutor offered me a position, investigating land fraud across the territory. It would mean traveling, dangerous work. It would mean making sure what happened here doesn't happen elsewhere," Samuel finished. "You should take it." "What about us? The ranch?" "Can be our home between assignments, a place to come back to when the world gets too heavy." He kissed her forehead. "Besides, someone needs to keep those books you straightened out, and that room with the single bed will always be waiting." "Still trying to scandalize the territory, Mr. Hayes?" "Every chance I get, Mrs. Collins-to-be." As they walked back toward the ranch, Rebecca marveled at how much had changed since that night at the Dusty Spur. She'd arrived broken and desperate, willing to accept any shelter. Now she was leaving, temporarily, as someone who'd helped break the chains of corruption that had bound an entire community. The single bed that had caused such scandal would indeed be waiting, but it would be in a home built on justice and partnership, not desperation. And that, Rebecca thought as Samuel's hand found hers, was the most perfect ending of all. The story of the widow who said, "That's perfect," to a single bed would be told in Coyote Ridge for generations. Not as a scandal, but as the moment when one woman's defiance sparked a revolution that brought down an empire of greed and gave a community back its soul. 6 months had passed since the trial that freed Coyote Ridge from Watson and Holloway's grip. The town had transformed. Families had reclaimed their lands. New businesses had opened. And the railroad spur that was meant to enrich a few now brought prosperity to many. Rebecca stood on the platform of the newly built train station, watching the steam engine that would take her to her next assignment, investigating land fraud in Nevada. 3 weeks this time? Samuel asked, his arm comfortable around her waist. The wedding band on her finger caught the morning sun. They'd married a month after the trial in a ceremony that packed the church with everyone whose lives they'd helped save. Maybe 4. The situation in Carson City is complicated. She turned in his embrace, memorizing his face as she always did before leaving. Will you be all right? I've got the Henderson boy helping with the cattle, and Martha promised to check in. He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Besides, I've got plenty to keep me busy. That irrigation project won't dig itself. The ranch had prospered with the return of law and order. They'd bought additional land, legitimately, and Samuel's cattle operation had expanded. But more than that, their home had become a gathering place for the community, a symbol of how standing together could overcome any adversity. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. Doris hurried up, now the efficient court recorder, her past life at the Dusty Spur a distant memory. I wanted to catch you before you left, Rebecca. This came from the prosecutor's office. Rebecca opened the envelope, scanning its contents. They've found evidence of similar schemes in 3 more territories. Holloway's network was larger than we thought. All the more reason for your work, Samuel said, though she heard the reluctance in his voice. He supported her calling, but the separations were hard on both of them. Pete Cleary approached with his grandson, a boy of about 10, who stared at Rebecca with obvious hero worship. Mrs. Hayes, Tommy here wrote a composition about you for school, about how you saved our town. I didn't save it alone, Rebecca said, kneeling to the boy's level. Your grandfather was one of the brave ones who stood up. Remember that. Evil prospers when good people stay silent, but it crumbles when they stand together. The train whistle blew, signaling imminent departure. Rebecca kissed Samuel goodbye, a proper public kiss that still managed to convey volumes. I'll write every day. And I'll be here when you get back, he promised. Always. As she boarded, Rebecca saw the Kowalskis on the platform, returning from visiting family with funds to rebuild their burned home. Jan Kowalski caught her eye and tipped his hat, a silent acknowledgement of all she'd done. Through the window, she watched Samuel grow smaller as the train pulled away, but she carried his strength with her. The journey gave her time to reflect on how far they'd all come. That desperate night at the Dusty Spur seemed like a lifetime ago. She'd been running then, broken by loss and injustice. Now she was hunting those who created such losses, armed with the law and the knowledge that one person could make a difference. Her work in Carson City proved even more challenging than expected. The land grab there involved politicians at the highest level, and threats came daily. But Rebecca had learned to navigate danger, to document everything, to build cases that couldn't be dismissed. When things got particularly dangerous, she thought of Samuel waiting at home, of the room with the single bed that now held 2, and found the strength to continue. 3 weeks stretched to 6 before she finally broke the case, exposing a senator's involvement in forcing Native American tribes off mineral-rich lands. The trial made headlines across the West, and Rebecca found herself called as far as Washington to testify before Congress about systematic land fraud in the territories. But finally, on a dusty afternoon 2 months after she'd left, Rebecca stepped off the stage in Coyote Ridge. Samuel was there, of course, sweeping her into an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground. Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes. It's good to be back, Mr. Hayes. The ranch had changed in her absence. The new irrigation system had turned brown fields green, and she could see the framework of what looked like an addition to the house. What's that? She asked as they rode home. Well, I figured if we're going to fill up all these bedrooms, we'd better build more bedrooms. Rebecca felt her breath catch. Samuel Hayes, are you suggesting... Doc Morrison confirmed it last week. Congratulations, Papa-to-be. The joy on his face matched her own as they absorbed this new miracle. A child, born of love rather than desperation, hope rather than fear. That evening they hosted what had become a regular gathering, families sharing meals, stories, and plans for the future. The Hendersons were there, their reclaimed farm prospering. Pete Cleary regaled everyone with tales of the old days, though now his stories ended with triumph rather than bitterness. Even Judge Thorne attended, having come out of retirement to serve as circuit judge for a territory finally serious about justice. I have an announcement, Rebecca said as the meal wound down. "This was my last investigation trip. The territorial prosecutor has agreed to let me work from here, reviewing documents and training new investigators." "So you're staying?" Martha Henderson asked hopefully. "I'm staying. Coyote Ridge is home now." The cheer that went up could probably be heard in town. Samuel pulled her close, whispering, "That's perfect." Later, as their guests departed and quiet settled over the ranch, Rebecca and Samuel sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. The night was peaceful, so different from those tense evenings when they'd first discovered Watson's schemes. "Do you miss it?" Samuel asked. "The travel, the danger, the big cases." "Sometimes," Rebecca admitted. "But I've learned something. The most important battles aren't always the biggest ones. Sometimes they're fought in small towns by ordinary people who simply refuse to accept injustice. Like a widow who wouldn't be ashamed of needing shelter, and a cowboy who offered protection to a stranger." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, until Samuel spoke again. "I've been thinking about that night at the Dusty Spur. If you hadn't been so bold, if you'd been properly scandalized by that single bed, we'd never have met. Watson would still be in power. All those families would still be displaced." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "Sometimes scandal is just another word for necessary change." "Rebecca Hayes, philosopher," he teased. Rebecca Hayes, retired investigator, expectant mother, and keeper of the most perfectly imperfect ranch in the territory. As they finally went inside, Rebecca paused at the door of what had been her room those first nights, the room with a single bed that had started everything. They'd kept it as a guest room, though now it served more as a reminder of how far they'd come. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Just remembering how desperate I was that night, how certain the town was that I was ruined." She leaned back against him. "Now look at us, respected, established, about to start a family. All because I refused to be ashamed of needing that single bed. And because you said that's perfect when the world expected you to be scandalized." They moved to their own room, larger, with a bed built for two and windows that faced the sunrise. As they settled for the night, Rebecca thought about the letter she'd write tomorrow to the young woman investigator taking over her territory. She'd tell her to be brave, to document everything, to remember that justice was worth fighting for. But mostly, she'd tell her this: sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to be ashamed of your circumstances. Sometimes saying that's perfect when the world offers you less than you deserve is the first step toward claiming everything you're worth. The stars wheeled overhead. The ranch slept peacefully, and in the house that had once sheltered conspiracies and gunfire, new life grew. Rebecca Collins Hayes, who'd arrived in Coyote Ridge with nothing but grief and a carpet bag, had found love, purpose, and a home. And that, she thought as sleep claimed her, was absolutely perfect. In the morning, she'd help Samuel with the cattle, work on training materials for new investigators, and plan for the child who would grow up in a world made a little more just by their efforts. But tonight, she simply held her husband close and marveled at a journey that began with a single bed in a scandalous location and ended with a life fuller than she'd ever dared imagine. The transformation of Coyote Ridge stood as testament to what could happen when one person said enough, and others found the courage to stand with them. And somewhere in the territorial records, carefully filed by Doris McKenna, lay the documents that proved how a widow's defiance had brought down an empire and built something better in its place. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but in this corner of it, justice had won. And it had all started with two simple words: that's perfect. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope you enjoyed following Rebecca and Samuel's journey from that scandalous night at the Dusty Spur to their triumph over corruption and finding of true love. Please comment below and let me know where you're listening from so we can connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about this tale of courage, justice, and romance in the American frontier. What was your favorite moment? Let me know in the comments.